and truths of their own. While Athens might fall, Jerusalem would not. The times may change, but the Church remains the same. In reality, the churches have often shifted with the cultural tides. As the mores of the times have changed, so the churches have had to shift. But rarely have they shifted so swiftly as they have in joining the war on the underpinnings of the West. The story is playing out across denominations. A decision by the churches to throw their lot in with the anti-Western fashions of the day, and to apologize not just for their own pasts, but for their own unique cultural gifts to the world. The Church of England has long led the way in this trend. For a generation, it has found itself in a position of having to apologize for spreading its gospel around the world and being embarrassed by its former missionary zeal. In recent years, it has also decided to take upon itself the most hostile possible critique of itself. In February 2020, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, gave a speech to the General Synod of the Church of England. In it, he apologized for the institutional racism of the Church of England. The Archbishop said, "I am sorry and ashamed. I'm ashamed of our history, and I'm ashamed of our failure. There is no doubt when we look at our own church that we are still deeply institutionally racist." At the time that Welby gave this speech, the next most important bishop in the church besides himself was John Sentamu, the then Archbishop of York. Despite his number 2 hailing from Uganda, nobody seemed to think there was anything off about this description of the church. In fact, the Archbishop and the hierarchy of the church persisted, and throughout a year in which every church in the land was shut due to COVID restrictions, the church authorities worked away on a task force to look at the question of racism. The results, published in a report titled "From Lament to Action," was spurred by the death of George Floyd, who it described as a 46-year-old practicing Christian who worked to mentor young people and oppose gun violence. This was perhaps the only generous estimation in the report. In its draft form, the report was rife with warnings about the racism of the dwindling and at this point literally shuttered Anglican Church. It warned that racism is whispered in our pews. It had often been joked that the C of E was the Tory party at prayer, but by 2021 the Church's own self-estimation seemed to be that it was the KKK at prayer. When talking of the institutional racism that the report claimed to be so rife in the Church, it insisted, "The time for lament at such treatment is over. The time for action has now come." What would that action look like? Well, certain remnants of the Anglican style remained, and so there were calls for the identifying of work streams that might in turn report to a commission. These streams, covering every aspect of the Church, would publish a final report to note the continuing impact of institutional racism both within the society and the Church. Otherwise, the report called for several things, including quotas, obviously. Henceforth, there should be one UKME, UK minority ethnic clergy, elected from each region. Something called programme cohorts should have a minimum of 30% UKME participation in order to build up pipeline supply. And in happy bureaucratese, the document said that the Church should develop an online module for anti-racist learning programme. All shortlists must include at least one appointable UKME candidate, and where this did not occur, the recruiter should provide valid, publishable reasons for failure. Since there are almost 5,000 nominally Church of England schools across the country, the report recommends that all its primary and secondary schools work to develop a broad RE curriculum with specific reference to the promotion of racial justice. They must all mark Black History Month, celebrate diverse saints and models, modern Anglican saints/martyrs, and the Church's theology too must change. The curriculum for ordinands must include participation in an introductory Black theology module. They must diversify the curriculum, produce a workable plan for increasing racial diversity, and formally adopt Racial Justice Sunday in February of each year. All this will be overseen by the creation of a Racial Justice Unit to be funded in these cash-strapped times for a 5-year fixed-term basis in the first instance. Why does the C of E behave like this? It is not as though other religions look around at their congregations and ask why they are not more diverse. Nor do other religions seem intent on chasing their existing adherents away. Yet the C of E does do this, in spite of the fact that it is not as though the Church is absolutely chock-a-block with people wishing to join it. Nevertheless, the Church continues to try to force a new demographic and belief upon itself. Its report said that those ordinands who do make it through must be forced to examine the underlying theological assumptions that shapes racial justice, such as Eurocentrism, Christendom, and white normativity. The report stressed the need to decolonize theology, ecclesiology, and possibly examine official teachings of the Church that follows prejudicial theological value system. And, of course, it argued for going forward by once again going backward to the issue of slavery. It must again acknowledge, repent, and take decisive action to address the shameful history and legacy of the C of E's involvement in the historic transatlantic slave trade. At the start of the 2020 BLM protests, a statue of the 17th century British philanthropist and slave trade investor Edward Colston had been toppled from its plinth in the city of Bristol and pushed into the harbour. The C of E claimed that the BLM movement, and in particular the dumping of the Colston statue in Bristol docks, shed new light and brought needed urgency to the C of E's consideration of its own contested heritage. The report makes it clear that the Church is going to have to bring down monuments and statues that disturb the modern mind, for our churches should be welcoming spaces for all, and we must deal with any part of the church building that may cause pain or offence. In conclusion, the Church itself must change. One barrier to inclusion for people from UKME backgrounds has been the challenge of cultural assimilation into the Church, where there is perceived to be little or no room for cultural expression outside of a normative culture which is predominantly white middle class. Apparently there is an expectation upon UKME communities to abandon their own cultural heritage and current expression in favour of traditional host approaches. And so, the Archbishop's report concludes, it would seem to be easier all round if the host chose to abandon its own heritage, working alongside BLM and other interest groups to facilitate change. This must include the taking down of statues and monuments that were audited as being on the wrong side of any historical divides, leading to a vision of overstretched clergy being expected to scour their churches for errant statues. One of the strangest things about reading documents such as these is that they show an institution that has fallen for the most negative possible interpretation of itself. The Anglican Communion is a naturally diverse community, binding together 41 provinces from places across the globe. Many of the Church of England's most vibrant, perhaps its only vibrant, churches are in Africa. And when I have spent time with the Christian communities there, in countries such as Nigeria, I have never seen them subjected to racism from white people. I have only seen deeply sincere believers in a gospel that missionaries from the churches of Europe once brought to them. Now, the institutions that once taught that gospel are busily preaching a different gospel. They are telling the world that they are racist and that they must change. It is a tale that, as another former C of E bishop, Michael Nazir Ali, has pointed out, proclaims the Church's faith in critical race theory rather than in Christ. As Nazir Ali said, there is no need for the Church to fall for this new religion, for it has a very fine story of its own to tell. The Christian faith has an uncommonly long tradition of opposition to slavery. St. Bathilda was a former slave herself, who campaigned for the abolition of slavery in the 7th century. St. Anselm outlawed slavery in 1102 while Archbishop of Canterbury. William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect spent all their energies and resources fighting to bring an end to the practice inspired in this vision by their Christian faith. In the 20th century, clergy had worked with Gandhi in his campaign for independence for India, and extraordinary clergymen such as Bishop Colin Winter and Bishop Trevor Huddleston campaigned against apartheid in South Africa. But all these women and men were forgotten by a church intent only on searching for the bad. As Nazir Ali asked, why not stop actively seeking darkness and instead look at the light? Why throw out the message of Christ for a message based on Marxist ideas of exploitation? But the voice of this wise former bishop was ignored. In the Church of England and other denominations across the West, the old religion worked hard to divest itself of its own traditions, and seemed intent on making the old faith nothing but yet another imitation of the new one. Woke Episcopalianism. In the United States, the Episcopal Church followed precisely the same pattern. In January 2021, the Episcopal Church published a racial audit of itself that cost $1.2 million to perform. It covered the years 2018 to 20, and, like their counterparts across the Atlantic, the Episcopalians pronounced themselves guilty from the outset. The goal of this research has not been to determine whether or not systemic racism exists in the Episcopal Church, but rather to examine its effects and the dynamics by which it is maintained in the church structure. It was critical to approach this objective with openness, rather than starting with pre-existing assumptions and conclusions. To this end, we have employed the guiding tools of grounded theory and the theoretical framework of critical race theory. The Episcopalians defined CRT as follows. CRT is a social and theoretical framework that understands race as a lens through which to seek understanding of the world. It insists, like critical theory at large, that social problems are created by structures and institutions rather than by individuals. Numerous scholars have contributed to the work of critical race theory, including Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, and others. Of course, none of this should have come as much of a surprise to anyone watching the church leadership in recent years. In a recent book recommendation on his website, the Episcopal Bishop of New York said that his diocesan book study would be Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. Bishop Deacher promised that Kendi tackles the deep currents of racism in our society and institutions, including what the bishop called the intractability of white supremacy. Unacknowledged racist assumptions infect every institution and system, and my heart and mind, and yours too, said the bishop, before concluding, "Reading this book convicted me, but made me grateful." It is against this background of wanting to find themselves guilty that the Episcopal Church approached its race audit, and the results showed that the clergy had swallowed wholesale the new gospel of Kendiism. Over 77% of the leadership defined racism as a combination of racial prejudice or discrimination, a system that grants power to one social group. They did not define it as an intention to harm one group or an outcome that harms one group. They defined it as a system of power which is much harder to see or fix without tearing that whole system down. The audit's own evidence showed no difference between the treatment of white leadership and BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Colour, leadership in the church. Both reported almost exactly the same levels of respect with which they felt they were treated. But some of the quotations used in the survey were alarming, to say the least. Noting only the race and status of the respondents, the audit quoted a white church leader saying, "The Episcopal Church has to stop being so white." A person of colour in the church's leadership is quoted saying, "There's war. We're in the middle of a war, and I don't know why people don't seem to be behaving as if we should be. We're gearing up for a fight for our very existence, black people in this country. We have a black head of the church, but the institution is institutionalized." Inevitably, the audit also came to the now traditional conclusions. One of the barriers for dealing with the church's systemic racism is people becoming defensive when systemic racism is named as a problem. Here is D'Angeloism at work. The best way for the church to be not racist is for it to be unbothered when it is accused of institutional racism. Elsewhere, it concludes that all answers must involve a multifaceted approach that should include the reparation and redistribution of wealth, though it warns that this should be attempted without exacerbating the problems of racism and white-dominant culture. The work ahead for the Episcopalians sounds amazingly grueling, but they keep stressing that they are up for it. Fully engaged leaders with a deep grasp of systemic racism apparently must stress the need to embrace the fact that anti-racism work is never done once and for all. There is going to have to be a long haul, but as the recommendations section says, there is much to do. The Church must develop an anti-racist leadership. It must think about intersectionality and confront the leverages of power. Most important is to continue to educate all white or predominantly white congregations about racialization and about the story/history of whiteness. It is also clear that the Episcopal Church in its anti-racism resources ought to shift the language in order to reflect both the ways white people are privileged and diminished by white supremacy culture and racist systems. Reparations, meanwhile, should continue to be encouraged on the local level as well. In the meantime, the Church can design effective interventions for communities at different points along the labyrinth, or, in anti-racism language, along the spectrum from exclusive club to anti-racist organization. Anti-racism work and racial healing cannot be a cookie-cutter approach and requires dynamic, agile, and multiple points of entry. Like the Church of England, the Episcopal Church in the United States has seen a vertiginous fall-off in its congregation in recent years. Like the Church of England, its pews are not just emptying, but also growing older. Like the church across the Atlantic, it spent much of 2020 to 2021 with its doors literally shut to its remaining flock. And, like the Church of England, it chose this precise moment to berate its remaining congregation for being too white supremacist, claim that they were members of a communion that was institutionally racist, and suggest that the answer to all of the Church's considerable range of problems lay in lecturing its remaining congregations about racism. The old gospel can barely be discerned in all of this, but the new gospel most certainly can be. Someday, it may be all there is left. Catholicism. Some people might say that this is just what the remains of the Church of England and the Episcopalian Church might be expected to do, and that there are other, more serious churches that would not stoop to the same fashionable standards. Yet, even the church that prides itself on being the one least likely to bend to or shift with the times, the Roman Catholic Church, is just as capable of caving in to the new religion of the current era. In June 2020, the Catholic chaplain of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Reverend Daniel Patrick Maloney, sent out a cautionary email to the Catholic community at the university, warning them, at the height of the protests, that George Floyd's killing may have had nothing to do with racism. He also questioned Floyd's character, given his previous convictions for violence. He said that while Floyd should not have been killed by the police officer, Floyd himself had not lived a virtuous life. He wrote, "Most people in the country have framed this as an act of racism. I don't think we know that." Speaking of police violence, Maloney warned against seeing racism as a major problem in the American police. Again, "I don't think we know that," he wrote. "The police deal with dangerous and bad people all the time, and that often hardens them," he said. Inevitably, the message was leaked out, and the mob came after him. A small number of people in the MIT community expressed hurt at the contents of the email. A vice president and dean for student life said that the message from Father Maloney was deeply disturbing. She accused Maloney of devaluing and disparaging George Floyd's character and of failing to acknowledge systemic racism. And the Catholic Church decided to give in to the new gospel. The Archdiocese of Boston swiftly distanced itself from the comments, and Maloney issued an apology for the hurt he had caused. The Archdiocese also asked Maloney to resign his position with immediate effect. Consequences. Perhaps it is inevitable that when the churches have such a view of themselves and their own history, people will take them at their word. What should someone with no knowledge of the churches make of institutions that say such things about themselves? An ever-increasing percentage of people have no experience of the Church of England, the Episcopalian Church, or any other church. When such institutions announce that they are institutionally racist and riven with bigotry, an outsider with no knowledge of them is likely to believe them. Why should they not? After all, who would say such things about themselves unless they were true? You have to know such institutions very well, to know that they are not what their leaders say they are, to know that most clergy spend their lives devoting themselves to their flock, helping the poor and doing good works. For people who have no experience of these institutions, there is no reason not to view them through the demonic lens through which they present themselves. And it is perhaps inevitable that, in time, that mix of ignorance and presumption of guilt will have consequences. In July 2021, when Canada was going through another orgy of statue toppling, one of the proximate causes that month was a strange moral panic that had taken hold in the country. The Canadian media had recently begun to report that numerous graves had been found near residential schools run by the Catholic Church in areas with First Nations communities in them. On the evidence of one unverified report based on ground penetration radar that was inconclusive, it was claimed that hundreds of unmarked graves existed. The media in Canada and then around the world claimed that the mass graves contained the bodies of children with the strong implication that they were indigenous children and the follow-on implication that they had been deliberately murdered by the Catholic Church. No bodies were found, and nothing had even been excavated. It was not clear that they were all children or that they were not in individual graves formally marked by wooden crosses. Canadians already knew from a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that thousands of students had died of diseases such as tuberculosis at these crowded schools. People started to burn down churches in Canada. Within a single week, almost 30 were torched or otherwise assaulted. The fact that many of the churches burned down were built by First Nations people did not detain those who had jumped on the anti-Canadian church's bandwagon. The then head of the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association took to Twitter to say, "Burn it all down." Caitlin Urquhart, a former volunteer at the Newfoundland Canadian Bar Association branch, said the same thing. A radio host demanded, "Burn the churches down." A Canadian law professor described the burnings as resistance to extreme and systemic injustice. And Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's top advisor and friend, Gerald Butts, said that while burning churches was not advisable, it may be understandable. In no time, a story had gone from a claim of a discovery of graves to a story of mass graves to a story of children deliberately murdered by the Catholic Church and buried in mass graves to Canadians actually burning down churches because they had become convinced that the churches had orchestrated the deliberate and organized mass murder of children. Because of course the churches would. Because the churches are racist, like everything else. Rationalism. Still, even if the churches and all philosophy are regarded as racist, there can still be one other hope for the Western mind. One final refuge that still exists, and which might be assumed to be sacrosanct. Simple logic and provable fact. We may not know our history, or not be confident of our history, or that our history was good. We may not be at all confident that the philosophical or theological roots of the West are not irredeemably corrupted by racism and its attendant sins. But there is at least the sanctuary of science, of math, of provable, verifiable fact. And on this ground, perhaps, something can be saved. Countries and churches may tremble, and histories may change, but the building blocks of logic, science, and math may still be relied upon. We may be sure of nothing else, but we may be certain that the Western traditions in these areas at least may continue. Once again, the hope is forlorn. One by one, the sense-making organs of the scientific community and other parts of the STEM world have fallen to the same one-note dogma of the time. The medical community was one of the first to fall into it. In the immediate aftermath of the George Floyd killing, public gatherings were still banned in most countries because of coronavirus restrictions. Governments had instituted such bans on the advice of the medical professionals. But as soon as the BLM protests began, more than 1,000 medical professionals in the United States signed a petition calling for them to be allowed to go ahead because opposition to racism is vital to the public health. As far as public health concerns went, the one thing that trumped even the coronavirus was racism. As the coronavirus crisis was going on, the lead journal of the medical world, The Lancet, ran a piece titled, Racism is the public health crisis. The publication also published an anti-racism pledge, professing that racism is a public health emergency of global concern. Anti-racism is a struggle all of us must join. The Lancet promised to educate ourselves about racism, pledge our solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, and turn that pledge into concrete actions in our own work. Other scientific journals have submitted to the same standard. In May 2021, Nature said in an editorial that the first anniversary of the death of George Floyd was a reminder to the journal that systemic racism in science exists, and that the staff of Nature had to recognize our part in it. And not just their own part, but the part of science as a whole in perpetuating racism. As Nature said, tackling systemic racism requires the system of science to change. One of the few concrete suggestions that the journal came up with was to ensure that anti-racism is embedded within all scientific organizations and that such work wins recognition and promotion. According to Nature, too often conventional metrics, citations, publication, profits reward those in positions of power rather than helping to shift the balance of power. There is a lot in that. For instance, what is wrong with citations in scientific research? Is it better to have citations or not to have citations? The purpose of citations has generally been to provide evidence that the assertions contained are reliable and true. But if a scientific publication decides that such evidence is as good as an absence of evidence, or actually worse than an absence of evidence, then out goes one of the building blocks of the scientific method. Besides, why is it the task of a scientific journal to shift the balance of power? Why is its aim not simply to publish the best and most important research, whoever comes up with it, and whoever it benefits? It is at such times that one particularly conservative critique that used to exist in the culture wars is shown to be woefully inadequate. Conservatives used to joke that the wildest fringes of academic thought had boundaries that would be asserted naturally. These commentators claimed that ideas such as CRT may well run like wildfire through the humanities, but that even if this did happen, it did not matter overmuch. People were welcome to get themselves into debt studying for useless humanities degrees that educated them in non-disciplines, because all the time reality and the facts would continue to assert themselves in STEM subjects. These people asserted that while theory, with a capital T, might work in lesbian dance theory classes, it would halt at the borders of the hard sciences and mathematics. It would stop at the doors of engineering, because at some point the bridges had to stay up. Yet that claim, that hope, turns out to have been wildly optimistic. There turns out to be no reason why the tide that has rushed through everything else should halt at the borders of STEM. If you wanted to kick away the remaining building blocks on which everything else is built, then kicking away the block of mathematical certainty is a pretty good way to do it. It is a similar trick to kicking away the idea that there is any such fixed thing as men and women. It sows confusion without making anything else remotely clearer. But if you wish to simply disorient or demoralize people, then it is a good place to kick at. That is precisely what has been done in recent years with the development of equitable maths. This is the idea that math itself is problematic. The argument goes that math is elitist, privileged, and of course inherently racist. How can a system that owes its origins to several civilizations and was refined in the West in the last millennia, be seen as systematically racist? One way of doing this is to rely on scholars who have spent recent decades trying to define a whole set of aspirational ideas as inherently white supremacist and then attempting to anathematize them out of the field of education. For instance, Kenneth Jones and Tima Okun's Dismantling Racism, a Workbook for Social Change Groups, has been used by a lot of people in the field of education since its first publication in 2001. That work identified a number of norms and standards that it claimed were damaging because they promote white supremacy thinking. The authors claimed that these norms were damaging both to people of colour and to white people. The characteristics selected as being especially damaging included perfectionism, worship of the written word, sense of urgency, individualism, and objectivity. According to Jones and Okun, the idea that there is only one right way to do something in education is white supremacist. Instead, they recommend that when working with communities from a different culture, educators should be clear that you have some learning to do about the community's ways of doing things. They also criticize white people for valuing logic over emotion. All of this is fairly disastrous just as theory, but trying to put it into practice is catastrophic. Take, for instance, a guide for teachers published 20 years after Jones and Okun's work. Equitable Maths describes itself as a pathway to equitable math instruction, intended as a resource to give guidance to teachers of Black, Latinx, and multilingual students in America between grades 6 and 8. It cites Jones and Okun at the beginning of its first section, which is on Dismantling Racism in Mathematics Instruction. It accepts and develops their definition of white supremacy and sees white supremacy as running throughout mathematics. As a result, and citing Kendi, obviously, it urges teachers to identify what it means to be an anti-racist math educator. What it apparently means is supporting students to reclaim their mathematical ancestry by seeking to honor and acknowledge the mathematical knowledge of students of color, even if it shows up unconventionally. Again and again, the teaching guide gives ways to dismantle the culture of white supremacy that exists within the math classroom. Again and again, it seeks to do so by advocating that teachers presume that Black, Latinx, and multilingual students already have some special knowledge of math that is hard or impossible for white people to appreciate or access. Worse, it presumes that non-white students find normal math hard or impossible to appreciate or access. As ever, this mania has not been limited to America. The same ideas have spilled out everywhere. Ontario's Grade 9 D-streamed math curriculum, taught in Toronto's public schools, has tried to weed out Eurocentric mathematical knowledges and replace them with a decolonial anti-racist approach to mathematics education. This emerges in small details, such as removing the credit we give to a Greek mathematician by replacing the Pythagorean theorem with the term side-length relationship for right triangles. But it emerges in large details too. For instance, it insists that, contrary to the Eurocentric approach, in an anti-racist and anti-discriminatory environment, teachers know that there is more than one way to develop a solution, and students are exposed to multiple ways of knowing and encouraged to explore multiple ways of finding answers. This includes indigenous pedagogical approaches that emphasize holistic experiential learning and the use of collaborative and engaging activities that show respect for the diverse and multiple ways of knowing that are relevant to and reflective of students' lived experiences. But what exactly are these other ways of knowing? What might they look like? One example of what anti-racist math might look like emerged, like so much else, in the summer of 2020. During those months, several math people in the teaching profession attempted to deconstruct one of the foundations of mathematics, indeed of logic itself, namely the fact that 2 plus 2 equals 4. According to these educators, the statement is not true. While 2 plus 2 can equal 4, it can also allegedly add up to other numbers, including 5. For some reason, perhaps to do with absolutely everything being caught up in a culture war, a crowd of people swiftly latched on to the claim. Others claimed that it was obvious that 2 plus 2 cannot equal 4 and gave a variety of reasons. These included, but were not limited to, claims that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is part of a hegemonic narrative, that the people who make such narratives should not get to decide what is true, that 2 plus 2 should equal whatever people want it to equal, and that making such a definitive statement excludes other ways of knowing. As the movement gathered force, one PhD candidate took to social media to declare that the idea of 2 plus 2 equaling 4 is cultural, and because of Western imperialism/colonization, we think of it as the only way of knowing. An ethnic studies math teacher at Washington State University called on people to attack the haters by proving that there are ways to make 2 plus 2 equal 5. Soon, a biostatistics PhD at Harvard was trying to help out by saying that numbers are quantitative measures and abstractions of real underlying things in the universe, and it's important to keep track of this when we use numbers to model the real world, which cleared things up. Scores of other people, notably math teachers, took to social media to try to help out. Some people described the idea of 2 plus 2 equaling 4 as a simplification of reality. But the main aim of the activist teachers was clear: to sock it to the white supremacists by proving that 2 plus 2 does not equal 4. It is possible that none of these activists had read George Orwell's most famous book. Or it is possible that they had read it years before, forgotten it, dismissed it as a work of another dead white male, or, likeliest of all, assumed that its contents did not apply to them. But the whole 2 plus 2 equals 4 debate was especially instructive because in 1984 there is a resonant passage where Orwell writes that, "In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. It was inevitable that they should make that claim sooner or later. The logic of their position demanded it, not merely the validity of experience, but the very existence of external reality was tacitly denied by their philosophy." Too late, the bioethics PhD at Harvard, who had leapt into the 2 plus 2 equal 5 case, came to recognize the link to Orwell. When he was informed of it, he ended up describing it as unfortunate. It is possible to dismiss all of this as simply a set of culture warriors battling each other in the public square without much in the way of real-world repercussions. But such an interpretation would be utterly wrong. The drive to make math, when done correctly, into a symbol of white supremacy means that standards in the subject, as in any and all other subjects, will be lowered or expunged altogether. What other possibilities are there when everything that is provable is doubted and everything that can be tested is turned into part of the problem? The consequences of this are now spilling out at schools across America and the rest of the West. Across America, there are now precisely such attempts to alter or eliminate the admissions system, ridding the system of selective admissions and moving to a system of lottery-based admissions. This is based on the belief that selection favors specific racial groups and that in order to achieve equity, the system must be disrupted. One of those pushing for this in her district is San Francisco Public School Commissioner Allison Collins, who argued in 2020 that when we talk about merit, meritocracy, and especially meritocracy based on standardized testing, I'm just going to say it. In this day and age, we cannot mince words. Those are racist systems. If you're going to say that merit is like fair, it's the antithesis of fair, and it's the antithesis of just. Ibram X. Kendi is also against standardized testing in schools. People may be unsurprised to learn what accusation Kendi levels against standardized testing. In 2019, he said, "I'll say it again and again. Standardized tests have become the most effective racist weapon ever devised to objectively degrade black minds and legally exclude their bodies." This is not a fringe idea. Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, has said, "Standardized testing doesn't help kids learn, and it doesn't help teachers teach. We need to measure what matters." And what exactly is it that matters? We are never told. Of course, the consequences of the war on standardized testing can be easily foreseen. Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology in Alexandria, Virginia, is not only struggling with its problematic name, it has also been struggling in recent years to change its admissions policy in order to be less selective. As it happens, the school had already undergone a significant shift in its makeup. 20 years ago, 70% of the school's students were white. By 2020, 79% were minority ethnic, mostly from families of immigrant Asian origin. White students accounted for only 19% of the students that year. The failure to create any significant shift in the black admissions during this period was inevitably put down to systemic racism. And so, in the wake of the George Floyd murder, there was a move to introduce a lottery admissions policy, which was objected to by a large proportion of the school's parents. Those in favor of the policy said that they sought to have a school population that more closely mirrored the national population. But even if the policy was followed through, it would only have marginally altered the share of black and Hispanic students at the school. What it would have done is a number of other things. It would have meant a forced increase in the number of white students at the school by roughly an extra 25%, and a forced decrease in the number of Asian students by roughly an extra 20%. As other schools and colleges across the country struggle with the same problem, from New York to California, they continue to find themselves facing the same conundrum. If the problem in everything is racism, and the answer to everything is to disrupt the racist system, It appears to produce only two verifiable outcomes: a lowering of standards in the name of anti-racism, and a rise in the need for racist policies in order to deal